first panel on the life and legacies of William F. Buckley Jr., the founder of National Review, and most certainly, perhaps the most important and influential journalist of the 20th century, something that I'm sure annoys the mainstream media to no end. William F. Buckley Jr., 1920 to 2008. Last year, National Review Institute commemorated a decade since his passing. We thought it appropriate to begin the conference this year with a little context and history and reminiscence about our founder. You know, one of the most important things about William F. Buckley Jr. was his joie de vivre, as he would probably say, his spirit, his love of life. And it was that sense of life and sense of humor that I think made him such an aspirational figure to so many generations of conservatives, which you can see just by looking at the lineup of this panel. A few examples of Buckley's humor, which I came across recently that I thought appropriate to start. In 1980, shortly after Reagan was elected president, Morley Safer of 60 Minutes interviewed Buckley to kind of, I guess, probe the conservative mind. And Safer asked Buckley toward the end of the interview, "Mr. Buckley, what would you do if there turned out to be a Buckley somewhere in the world who was a liberal?" And Buckley didn't bat an eye. He looked at Morley Safer and said, "I would pray for him."
Yes.
That's one of the lesser-known Buckleys, of course, the famous quotation from 1965 when he announced his mayoral run in New York City. And the first question in the press conference was asked by a reporter and said, "Mr. Buckley, what will you do if you're going to win, if you win?" And he said, "Demand a recount." My other favorite is, he was once asked, Robert Kennedy once appeared on firing line and did so poorly that he refused to ever return. And Buckley was once asked about this. He said, "Mr. Buckley, why won't Robert F. Kennedy go on your show?" And he looked at the interviewer and said, "Why does bologna resist the grinder?" Buckley leaves several legacies that we'll spend some time touching on throughout this panel. There's the personal legacy, not just in his son Christopher, but also all the many lives he touched. There's the institutional legacy, which is, of course, incarnate in this room. There's the political legacy, understanding Buckley as a political leader. There's the, I dare say this word in a room full of conservatives, the ideological legacy, the legacy in ideas, and how Buckley was able to espouse what he called the philosophy of freedom and really stand as its mascot and arbiter throughout his career. There's also kind of the Buckley legacy of spirit. And I think it was summed up in another quote, which I have to read, because it shows, I think, it illustrates how Buckley, like Krauthammer, who was mentioned earlier, understood that politics is essential precisely because politics is a foundation for all those things that we care about in life. So if you get politics wrong, you can't enjoy the beautiful, you can't enjoy the good, you can't enjoy all the wonderful art, all the culture, all of the pastimes that make life worth living. And Buckley once wrote in one of his columns, I quote, "I like, roughly in the order described, 1, God, 2, my family, 3, my country, 4, J.S. Bach, 5, peanut butter, and 6, good English prose." And he was responding to people, to a critic who had said that he had failed to disclose some relationship in one of his columns. So here he lists the things that he likes. And he continued in his column, "Should these biases be identified when I write about, say, Satan, divorce, Czechoslovakia as opposed to the United States, Chopin as opposed to Bach, marmalade as opposed to peanut butter, or as opposed to good English prose, the editorials of the New York Times?" So one could go on quoting William F. Buckley Jr. All day, so I'll stop and introduce our panel. To my left is Neal Freeman, who goes back many, many years with National Review and Buckley, and was one of the original producers of Firing Line. To his left is John O'Sullivan, who succeeded Buckley as editor of National Review. And to his left is Lee Edwards, the historian and Heritage Foundation scholar who has written a very good and accessible biography of William F. Buckley Jr. So Lee, why don't you kick us off?
Well, there's so many things you can say about Bill in trying to talk about him, but I want to plant this thought that he was a master fusionist, that until Buckley came along, we had a bunch of ill-assorted, half angry and half enemy conservatives out there, situated in outposts throughout the United States. There might be a professor here and a columnist there and so forth, but no unity. And Bill reached out to these various different conservatives and said, look, we have a common enemy, and that common enemy are liberals. Let's focus on them and not on ourselves. So as a matter of fact, he then reached out and brought on board the masthead and in effect created this same mixture for the conservative movement, traditional conservatives, libertarians, and anti-communists initially. Then later on welcomed in the neocons and even the new right. But he said not welcome are the kooks, the anti-Semites, and the God-haters. And if I may, Matt, I will tell a story. So Bill was at a cocktail party, and there was Ayn Rand. And Ayn Rand comes up to him. She had a very thick Russian accent. And she said, Mr. Buckley, you are too intelligent to believe in God. And so Bill was thinking, now, what could I say to that? He didn't immediately reply, but that Christmas, he sent her a Christmas card in Latin. And she never again troubled Bill Buckley. He was so important to us as an example of civility, as an example of reaching out and listening to each other and not screaming and not yelling. And so I think of the founding of Young Americans for Freedom in 1960 at Sharon, his home, and he was there very much so, and we were all collected there as young conservatives. And we had a debate, a very, you might say even a fierce debate about the wording of the Sharon Statement. What should that be? And it came down to whether or not we should include the phrase God-given rights. The debate went on, and finally we took a vote. And by only 44 to 40, those who were for retaining that phrase, God-given rights, prevailed. Now what's important about that, I think, is that we came together, we were civil in our discourse, but that nobody walked out. The libertarians were not so angry, said, well, this is it, we're not going to go along with this, we're going to walk out. They didn't do that. They accepted that, and I think that's a wonderful example for us today to try to bring conservatives together and keep them together. One final thing I might say, and that, of course, is this wonderful run for the mayor of New York City in 1965. What did he do that was different? And I think, and Neal, you can talk to this, of course, far better than I, but let me just say this, that he reached out to conservative Republicans and also blue-collar Democrats. That had not been done that much before. And Kevin Phillips, in his book, The Emerging Republican Majority, say that Bill Buckley uncovered and discovered for the first time this coalition, particularly of what became Reagan Democrats, who then provided very much the margin of victory for both Richard Nixon and for Ronald Reagan in their landslide victory. So master fusionist is what I love to call Bill Buckley. It's a wonderful example for us as we begin our discussion. What are the right ideas for conservatives and for Americans in this year?
Absolutely, thank you, Lee. I take this moment too to mention that you all have note cards, I believe, at your tables. If you have a question for any of the panelists about William F. Buckley Jr., his life, his thought, his civility, the many media in which he flourished. I'm often asked what Buckley think about Twitter, for example. Please write them down and they'll be collected and we'll devote some time at the end of the panel to addressing them. John.
Obviously, I think we've just heard what must be the main claim of Bill upon history and upon our attention, namely that he started National Review, that he started the conservative movement. That was the movement that went on to win the Cold War and change world history. So in a sense, you can't beat that achievement. You can do a lot of other things, but you're not going to be able to surpass that. But there is another thing Bill did, and he did a lot of things, Bill, and he didn't always do them well, of course, as he himself would concede. I believe one of his mottos in life was Chesterton's, if a thing is worth doing, it's worth doing badly. And he would write plays and conduct orchestras and do all kinds of things. But the second big thing he did, and I'm sure there are more too, but the second big thing he did was, in my view, the foundation of Firing Line and running it successfully for 33 years. Now, Firing Line was an extremely important program for a number of reasons. And a program which, by the way, it ran in its first incarnation for 22 years, from I think 66 until 88, and then 11 years later, sometimes on commercial channels, sometimes on PBS. It was the first serious long-form television program which treated its guests, whether they were opponents or friends, and they were both, with great respect. Of course, it was a debating program. He challenged, Bill would challenge people, but at the same time, they were able to get their argument across. He would examine their argument carefully and scrupulously before subjecting it to some of his own criticisms. That changed, in my view, the face of American television. Up till that time, there hadn't been a program of that character watched by millions of people. Incidentally, he got an Emmy for it, I think, 1 or 2 years out. So this was recognized by people who didn't necessarily, and probably people who choose the Emmys wouldn't have agreed with him. But nonetheless, everybody could see this was an important program. And so it changed American television in treating political and public issues with real seriousness, at the same time with embodying real criticism. If you look at the people who were on it, they contain virtually every famous statesman and political thinker and artistic thinker of the years in which Bill was active. Now, the second great achievement was, as what I've just said implies, they weren't all conservatives by a long chalk. Many were, and some were conservatives that most of us had never heard of until Bill brought them out of the woodwork and presented their ideas. And those ideas were often very complex. They needed time. But at the same time, those ideas were given time and given explication. I remember when Ken Minogue, my good friend and great Anglo-Australian political theorist, died, I had the task of writing an obituary. One of the things I did was I went and got the Firing Line program in which Bill interviewed Ken. And I've never heard Ken's ideas put so clearly, comprehensibly, and at the same time without making any concessions to popularity. Now, what that implies, and what was true, was that a lot of people on the left were given this opportunity. And that is one of the things that accounts for Bill's often surprising popularity with the left. Until Firing Line came along, many of the people on the left had never, as they often complained, had never had a chance to get their ideas presented to the American people in a way that would enable people to judge them fairly. And again on the program, Bill did that with people like Noam Chomsky. And the other interesting thing, and Neal would know this better than I do, but because I haven't seen all, 1900 versions of the program, but there was often very good-natured, humorous debate between someone like Chomsky and someone like Bill, because Bill at one point says to Chomsky, you're getting a bit overheated, aren't you? And Chomsky says slightly shamefully, he says, well, I do sometimes lose my temper, yes. So this was the second thing. It gave his opponents and the left the opportunity to present their views, and of course those views were tested and found wanting. I'm talking in the large view historically. And the third thing was The program made such an impact that it has been revived. Now, there are in effect two programs which draw on the legacy of Firing Line. One is called Firing Line. It has Margaret Hoover. It's produced from Hoover. The other is a very similar program done by someone, Peter Robinson, whom most of you, I think, know, which draws on the techniques and the seriousness of Bill's program, called Uncommon Knowledge. And those programs get their audience because of the memory of what Bill achieved. So I think the Firing Line was an enormous achievement. I think it changed our society for the better. The sad thing is, I don't see anything quite like it apart from those two programs, which are inevitably niche today.
Thank you, John. Neal? The last word.
The last word.
Before we go to
you.
questions.
Thank you. Mr. Lowry has occasionally accused me of being underprepared for these events, so I want it recorded. I have notes here. And I would not contradict a commander of the British Empire, watch your behavior today, or the preeminent historian of the conservative movement. But as you get older, you notice few people around you are experiencing recency bias. There were two Bill Buckleys, of course. The hinge in his life is 1980, when Ronald Reagan is elected to the White House. As Jesse Jackson might have put it, we went from the outhouse to the White House. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, Bill was an establishmentarian. He was defending Reagan and Reaganism and all of those Buckley proteges who were issuing incendiary proclamations from various government agencies. He was, in those years, 1980 to his death in 2008, he dies, as you would expect, in that drafty garage in Stanford, writing a column. And he was, in those years, a model of civility. In the previous career, 1950, 1980, I would say he was a model of elegant incivility. The basic dynamic in the free society is this. It's the tension between the newcomer and the incumbents. Bill was the new guy with a new idea at Yale, at the Roman Catholic Church, in the Republican Party. He was taking on large institutions, not as an establishmentarian, but as an insurgent. And the fire he had, what I see as his legacy is not only the civility, which if you take his two careers, I'd morph into graciousness. I'll give you a great example of this. His graciousness at a time when it was at great cost to his legacy. This is 1964. We're in San Francisco with this young man on the left here, helping to manage Barry Goldwater's successful campaign for the Republican nomination. This is big news. The conservative movement, engineered by Bill Buckley and fronted for a time by Barry Goldwater, is taking over one of the great political parties in the world. This is very big news. And it was a great achievement for Barry and for Lee and his colleagues. It was also a great achievement for Bill Buckley and National Review. We got somewhere close to 100 invitations from media to interview Bill about his role, about National Review's role, broadcast, print, domestic, international. Everybody wanted to know that part of the story. And Bill, not wanting to step on Barry's lines, not wanting to put a foot on his spotlight, said, no, we're not going to talk to anybody, not even Teddy White. Theodore White is, at that time, the official historian of presidential politics, the making of the president, 60, 64, 68, et cetera. And Lee will correct my chronology, but I think Wednesday, Barry had the votes to be nominated. Thursday, he's to accept the nomination. Friday, he's to fly out of town on the first leg of his presidential campaign. Bill shoves all of the media requests off to Friday after Barry's departure and Saturday. Well, Wednesday afternoon, we get the word from Cliff White, our genius delegate counter, that Barry's got it. Even with the weak sisters falling away under pressure from Nelson Rockefeller and so on, we have it. I rush back to the St. Francis Hotel, where Bill has a suite, thinking, now the party begins. This is going to be big. I get there, and there are 3 people in the suite, only 3 people. Bill Rusher, the publisher, Jim McFadden, the associate publisher, and there's obviously been some drinking. But this is not drinking of celebration. It's drinking of commiseration. We've just gotten word from New York that Maureen Buckley O'Reilly has dropped dead of an embolism. Maureen is 29, 30, has 4 or 5 small children. The Buckley women tended to be fertile, as you may have heard. 2 things have happened. Jerry O'Reilly, on a fast-track corporate career, suddenly is the single father of 4 or 5 small children. Jerry O'Reilly, if you met him, he died a couple of months ago. The second most charming man in the country. The first, of course, being the Honorable James Lane Buckley, from whom you'll hear tomorrow. We all loved Maureen. Maureen was feisty and flirty and irresistible. Bill was crushed. He packs up, flies back to the East Coast to be with his family. And those back-to-back media interviews were almost all canceled. Bill Rusher took a couple, I took a couple, but it wasn't the same thing. And so the point never got consolidated how magnificent, how historical Bill's achievement had been. Think of it. 64, Barry Goldwater gets nominated for president. You sweep forward to 2016 when Trump breaks all the furniture. In between, every Republican nominee is either a Buckley conservative or somebody who pretends to be. The last in that line, Mitt Romney. I happened to be working in Boston when Romney was governor. Man of rectitude, man of competence, but a very liberal governor. He's pro-choice, he's pro-gun control, he's high tax, he's single-payer health care. He wants to run for president. He does a 180 on all the issues, the full Kirsten Gillibrand. And he runs from Utah. He never heard of that guy back in Boston, right? That was how pervasive, how intimidating the Buckley legacy was in the Republican Party for a half century. And the reason historians haven't written about it is because historians write from the file. If the piece of paper is not in the file, it never happened. Well, it did happen, and Bill left many legacies, but that was one of the great ones, and it will reverberate down the years. Thank you.
Thank you, Neal. We'll start turning to questions, and please, if you have any, write them down, and we'll come and collect them. I think maybe the first question should go to Lee, as someone who was there when Young Americans for Freedom was created, and that is, what advice do you think Buckley would give to Yaffers today?
Well, I think he'd say, continue to be outrageous, continue to gamble, continue to demonstrate, because Young Americans for Freedom is a political action organization, unlike Young America's Foundation, which is an educational organization. So I think that he would say, figure out how to apply the basic principles of conservatism. I think of, for example, one of the things that we did, Firestone was going to build a plant in Romania This is during the Cold War. We were absolutely opposed to that, Young Americans for Freedom, trying to get them to stop, and they kept moving ahead with that. And finally we said, well, now, if you decide to go ahead with this, okay, but the Indianapolis 500-mile race is coming up, and all those wonderful Firestone tires are being used. We're going to take a plane and have it circle over and have it say, don't trade with the enemy. Don't trade with the enemy, and have that circle all day during the race. Guess what happened? They canceled the factory. So that, to me, is the kind of imaginative action items which ought to be doing today.
And certainly the place of conservatives on campus is very tenuous today with the speech codes and political correctness and campus radicalism, the BDS movement that targets Israel. I recently revisited God and Man at Yale, published in 1951. It's actually it's somewhat scary how well it holds up. On the other hand, it's comforting because it suggests nothing has really changed on the university in 60 years other than from a conservative. Of course, we always think things are getting worse. They have, but there's also some hope, I think, that as long as there's a conservative presence reminding people of right reason, there's hope to maintain some bulwark in these institutions. Yes, Neal.
Let me say something about Yale. As you know, Bill announces himself on the national stage by writing this book-length attack on Yale. God and Man at Yale. Not a great book, but an amazing piece of work for a college student. And you have to put that in context. He loves Yale. He meets 4 of the 5 or 6 most important people in his life at Yale. Van Galbraith becomes his best friend for life. Wilmore Kendall becomes his most important mentor. Brent Bozell becomes first his soul brother and then his brother-in-law. And through Brent, he meets Patsy Taylor, who becomes Bill's beloved wife for 50 plus years. I knew Bill a long time. I saw him cry only 3 times. Once was when late in his life, Yale awarded him an honorary degree. The emotion of building for decades just flowed out. But he felt it was his duty to point out that Yale was a flawed institution, that those flaws ought to be identified and addressed. And as Matt says, 70 years on, that analysis looks better and better. Remarkably prescient.
Absolutely. John, I want to ask you this next question. The questioner observes that Bill was so utterly an American and such a figurehead of American conservatism and all that represents, but I wonder, John, if you could speak for a moment on his international impact as someone who probably first became aware of Buckley from across the pond.
Yes, Bill did have an international impact, but it was sort of an unusual one because you would have expected someone who was, after all, a brilliant debater and arguer in the English language, that his impact would be first in countries like Britain and Australia and Canada and so on. And he did have that impact, but he had it later. And that impact was, in a way, part of firing line, because one of his talents was to talent spot brilliant young people everywhere. And quite a few people got their start in kind of public life because they were debaters at Oxford or Cambridge who were noticed by Bill on his visits there and who brought them onto the program. I knew several people who entered politics, essentially given a rocket boost by that. But more important than that, and very significant in view of what events happened in the great world in general, was that his major impact was in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, probably more in Eastern Europe than the Soviet Union for a long time, because National Review and Bill were the people who, in the most clear, unambiguous, and bold way, told the truth about what was going on in Eastern and Central Europe, that there was oppression, there was economic failure, there was cruelty, there was the worst kind of corruption. Now, this was, of course, the basis for the regime's hatred of him and denunciation of him. But whenever you went to that part of the world, you find that the people who most they talked about as the people they admired were Bill Buckley, Ronald Reagan, and Margaret Thatcher. Now that's later, of course, but even early on, I was given a dinner party once in Rome by an American diplomat and his wife, and I was then in Downing Street, and I'd just come from there, and I was the odd man out, treated by all the liberal, mainly American diplomats around the table as the kind of plenipotentiary for a crazed regime. And at one point, Central Eastern Europe came up, and I expressed the view you would have all had about what the situation was there. And everybody scoffed, and there was one troubled-looking man who said, well, I hate to say this, but I've just come back from a tour of Central Europe and Eastern Europe for the World Bank. And you know, everybody says there what Mr. O'Sullivan has just been saying. And they really, they admire the Reagan administration. They admire Bill Buckley. They talk about National Review. And when in 1990 we National Review went on to 1990 and 91, under Bill, we went to that part of the world. People lined up to shake his hand. One man had been sentenced to be a coal. They work in a factory shoving coal into a furnace. He was now a minister. He'd gone straight from the factory to the ministry. He was given that kind of treatment because as a younger man, a student, he had been bold enough to go to the American embassy and ask to read National Review in their library. The regime discovered this and they sentenced him to be a stoker. And there were any number of stories you could tell from that you heard in that part of the world. So I think Bill's impact was because he confronted tyranny. He did so clearly and boldly, and of course he did so wittily. So that I think if you don't have much to alleviate your despair if you're a conservative or a Christian or a liberal in that part of the world at that time. But when you read Bill, you said to yourself, they can never win. And that was his contribution.
I just would add quickly that in 1975, when Alexander Solzhenitsyn came to, I'm not sure how busy you were with the magazine at that point or not, John, but Bill went out of his way to make sure that was highlighted and pushing back against President Ford, who refused to meet with Alexander Solzhenitsyn, which in turn inspired Ronald Reagan to challenge him for the presidential nomination the following year. So Bill had this capacity to see who needed and who was the right person to get behind and really push, which he did with Alexander Solzhenitsyn.
Sure.
An underreported aspect of Bill's legacy is his courage. And I mean that in both the moral and the physical dimensions. It's hard to describe to you folks here in 2019 how lonely it was for Bill to be an avowed conservative in his circles in New York and Washington. The best thing about his courage was that it was contagious. We became courageous because Bill was courageous. And it extended equally into the physical realm. I mean, through the 60s and into the 70s, there were a lot of people who wanted to get in Bill's face, walking through an airport or at a restaurant or going down the sidewalk. Hard to believe, but at one point in my life, I was young and fit. But the real hero of those days was a guy named Rick Deason, who was a veteran of the Israeli Defense Forces. We appreciated Rick's company on many occasions. And this, during the Mayoralty campaign, Bill refused to attend the police briefings about threats to the campaign. He would send me, and I would come back hair curled about the threats made against Bill. Bill sailed on. And that courageous attitude, as I say, was contagious, very important to a fledgling movement.
I would say that young conservatives like myself, and I was young at that point, we wanted to be like Bill. We wanted to talk like Bill. We wanted to dress like Bill. We had our thesaurus, and we would open it up and say, okay, here's a pretty good word. Maybe I can stick that in there and shock people. I'm not sure what it means, but it looks okay to me. Let's go with it.
Yeah.
He was just a shining symbol for us.
Yes.
Absolutely. I'm wondering, Neal, maybe you can address this. It's true, we admire Buckley as kind of this model of civility and a model of reasoned debate and speaking to left, speaking to right, and kind of creating a platform for the intellectual discussions. And yet we often find that with the left, this strange new respect toward conservatives happens as soon as they depart the scene. I wonder, the questioner asks, is that not the case that sometimes figures like Buckley and even we see with Reagan are now being held over conservatives as a cudgel? How do you think we ought to address that?
Well, I'm not sure about that, but I'll ask a question very close to that, if that's okay with this group, which is that people seem to think that the raucous conversation of contemporary politics just started last week. It was vicious in the 60s. I remember the first time at NR in the early 60s to early 70s, it was a 7-day week, 2 days on the magazine, and then we'd all fan out for the next 5 days to build the movement, to evangelize, to visit college campuses. So life was very unfair. I remember one weekend, Bill goes to UCLA and he's cheered by thousands. I go to Reed College and I'm booed by hundreds. But on one occasion, Rusher and Buckley sent me out to Hunter College, very left-wing New York, what Rush Limbaugh would call a feminazi college. And I'm a kid from the suburbs, and my mother brought me up right, so I don't call people names. And I get called a bigot and a racist and a misogynist. And I got back to the office, and I had to look up misogynist. And anyway, unfortunately, this was an era when there were 7 daily newspapers in New York, and they didn't have much to cover, so they actually covered this event. And the next day, Rusher comes in to the editorial meeting and says, I'd like to inform the staff that one of our esteemed colleagues appeared last night at Hunter College. And he reads this short squib in the paper, one ineptitude after another by me, the fledgling debater, ending in the last paragraph with, Freeman was booed off the stage. Well, there's sort of a deathly quiet in the room, and Rusher says, all in all, a remarkable performance by Freeman. Well, that was the way it was. They were in that stage, the left, of ideological exhaustion, where the only thing they have left is name calling. And so this, what we're hearing today, these are the oldies but goodies. This isn't new stuff.
Any other comments on that? No?
Yes, one thing. I was at a dinner earlier this week in Budapest, and one of the guests at the dinner made a very significant point in relation to what you were saying, and in relation to your story about God-given rights. And what he said was, at the end of the Cold War, there was a unified movement of anti-Soviet liberals and conservatives. And he said, what's now happening in the world is that those people who were opposed to communism and statism and all the intrusions of that kind of life, because they believed in God, because they believed in tradition, because they were patriots, are tending to go off on this side, and those who believed in it because they believed in a Bill of Rights, or, and I'm not suggesting you can't believe these two things, but because they were, in a sense, pure liberals, are going down a very different path. And in a way, Bill's achievement, in my view, was to not only to keep both sides on the same path, but also to, within what was largely an unbalanced coalition, to ensure that the side that believed in God-given rights and in patriotism rather than in diffused ideas of liberty was able to hold its own intellectually with the other side, and not only hold its own, but sometimes do more. That's something we're going to have to remember in the next 10 and 15 and 20 years.
I think I would just add to that as a political figure, and Bill Buckley was very definitely, very clearly, he was building not just a magazine, but a movement, and it's still with us and still has tremendous force. He would say, as any good politician would, that politics is all about addition and not subtraction. It's all about multiplication and not division. Now, those are perhaps cliches, but they do work. And I do think that Bill would put it more elegantly than I've just tried to do here, that the importance of bringing people together, keeping them together, and using diplomacy, using civility, using tact to keep them there.
We're coming down to a close here, so I thought maybe I'll take the moderator's prerogative and ask a final question of each of the panelists, and that is, out of Buckley's, I believe, 55 published works, all of them available in various stages of print or online at Amazon.com. Which is your favorite? Lee, we'll start with you.
Well, I think The Unmaking of a Mayor, his story of running for mayor of New York City, it's just a hoot. It really is. I mean, it's just fun to read. It's witty, it's clever, and at the same time, it's got some profundities in it as well. When he talks about his platform and his program, everything from a neighborhood watch to you don't have to have a medallion to be a taxi cab driver, doing away with property rights and tax rights, income taxes, if you're working in the inner city. So I think was a wonderful book and well worth reading and rereading.
John?
I liked that book, and probably that's the book I most more than all the others. But I like the collections of essays on conservatism. Did you ever see a dream walking, and so on?
Right.
Because after all, we knew roughly what we believed, but we didn't know precisely what we believed. And so Bill was able, in his peculiar way, to make us think and rethink, so that we discovered that the depth of our convictions was greater than we'd realized. And he turned a set of kind of, what was the liberal phrase? A set of, I think it was irritable mental gestures. It was Bill who turned the irritable mental gestures into a genuine philosophy.
Lionel Trilling.
Lionel Trilling.
Right.
Yeah.
Neal?
Well, I'll give a runner-up and then I'll give the winner. The runner-up is Nearer My God. If you have not read that, you remain spiritually malnourished, all of you. Read it. I think the subtitle is Autobiography of Faith. Wonderful book. But his best book, in his view, and over the years he persuaded me, was Gratitude. What Bill did was rescue the idea of patriotism. That wasn't a rumor that it became the refuge for scoundrels. It had. And what he taught us in that book and in his life was patriotic joy, how to love America openly and in a manly way and poetically, and most of all, gratefully.
Thank you. I'll just add Buckley's collected speeches, Let Us Talk of Many Things, is a great introduction into his life and thought. And as we close this panel at the beginning of this conference, Buckley, returning to that 60 Minutes interview with Morley Safer, was asked in 1980, does Ronald Reagan's election and coming inauguration mean that liberalism is finally defeated? Buckley replied, oh no, liberalism is never defeated, neither is original sin. So with that, thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your conference.